The abandoned church, Jacob's descent into darkness. Jacob had always been a curious kid, his adventurous spirit often getting the best of him. He loved exploring the town, especially the old areas where few dared to tread. One such place was St. Morton's Church, an abandoned, crumbling structure at the edge of town. It had been the centre of whispers and ghost stories for years. Once a place of worship, it was now shrouded in mystery and darkness. St. Morton's had been closed for nearly 2 decades, after a series of strange and tragic events took place within its walls. The most unnerving of these stories revolved around its basement, a forbidden place where only the priest was ever allowed to go. Rumours spread that the priest had conducted some sort of ritual down there, and that he vanished without a trace. Since then, no one had dared enter the church, let alone the basement. The townspeople said it was cursed, haunted by malevolent spirits that fed on the living. Despite the warnings, Jacob and his friends often played football in the churchyard, treating the grim structure as nothing more than a spooky backdrop to their games. Jacob had never believed in ghosts, after all. They were just stories meant to scare little kids, he thought. But one evening, as the sun began to set and cast long shadows across the yard, something happened that changed everything. They were mid-game when Jacob kicked the ball with a little too much force. It soared through the air and landed with a thud against the church's heavy wooden door. The door creaked open slightly from the impact, and the ball rolled into the darkness. The other boys stopped in their tracks, staring at the open door with wide eyes. "Leave it," one of them said, his voice shaky. But Jacob couldn't just leave it. It wasn't just any ball. It was his favourite. And besides, what was the worst that could happen? He told his friends to wait and ventured inside. The air was thick with dust, and the smell of damp wood and decay hit Jacob. Immediately, he paused for a moment, listening. With a deep breath, he walked further inside, his eyes scanning the dimly lit interior for the ball. It wasn't hard to find. The ball had rolled down a short flight of stairs and come to rest near the door leading to the basement. Jacob stared at it, his heart beginning to race. He knew the stories about this place, about what lo, but it was just a ball, he told himself. As he approached, the door to the basement creaked open, as though it had been waiting for him. The darkness beyond the door was thick, impenetrable, and seemed to swallow the light from the church's broken, stained glass windows. A cold gust of air rose from the stairwell, carrying with it a faint, almost imperceptible whisper. Jacob hesitated, the hairs on the back of his neck standing up. It was as if the basement was beckoning him, urging him to step closer. Shaking off his fear, he reached down and grabbed the ball. But just as he stood up to leave, he heard something. It was a soft, dragging sound coming from the basement, like something or someone was slowly climbing the stairs toward him. Jacob's blood ran cold. He raced to the door, pulling on the handle, but it wouldn't budge. His breath quickened as the dragging sound grew louder, closer. He spun around, his eyes fixed on the basement door. In the darkness, something shifted. At first it was just a shadow, but as it moved into the faint light, a tall, thin figure, its face obscured by darkness, but its eyes glowing faintly in the gloom. They were eyes that held no life, no soul. The figure took another step toward him. Ghosts weren't real, but as the figure drew closer, he could feel its presence, a heavy, suffocating weight that pressed down on him, making it hard to breathe. Jacob. The voice was barely a whisper, but it echoed in his head, making his skin crawl. It sounded like the voice of a child, desperate, pleading, "Help me." His legs felt like lead, but somehow Jacob managed to move. He darted toward the back of the church, away from the basement door, away from the thing that was following him. He could hear its footsteps now, slow and steady, echoing off the stone wall. Jacob's mind raced as he searched for a way out. There had to be another door, a window, something. But as he ran through the church, he realized that the building seemed different from when he had entered. The walls seemed to shift, elongate, twisting in ways that defied logic. It was as if the church was alive, and it was keeping him trapped inside. His heart pounded in his chest as he spotted a small door at the far end of the building. Without thinking, he sprinted toward it, his breath coming in ragged gasps. But just as he reached the door, he felt something cold brush. He froze, too terrified to move. Slowly, he turned his head, and there it was, the figure now just inches away. It towered over him, its face still hidden in shadow, but its eye. Jacob, Jacob. The voice was louder now, more insistent. Jacob screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the darkness. The figure wrapped its cold, shadowy hands around him, pulling him down into the floor, into the very stone itself. The world around him began to blur, and for a moment all he could feel was cold, icy, bone-chilling cold. And then everything went black. The next morning, Jacob's friends told the police what had happened, how he had gone into the church and never come out. But when the authorities arrived, there was no sign of him. The door to the basement was sealed shut, just as it had been for years, and no amount of force could open it. The town searched for Jacob for weeks, but he was never found. His disappearance became another tragic story attached to the cursed St. Morton's Church. But the strangest part was what happened a few weeks after his disappearance. Late at night, some of the townspeople began to hear strange sounds coming from the abandoned church, soft whispers, dragging footsteps, and sometimes they said it was Jacob, lost in the darkness, forever trapped in the basement of the cursed church, just like the others who had vanished before him. And if you stood close enough to the church on a quiet night, you could still hear his voice calling for help, but never able to escape. Jacob, Jacob. The news of Jacob's disappearance spread like wildfire through the small town. At first, the townspeople treated it as another unfortunate incident in a long line of mysterious events connected to St. Morton's Church. But this time was different. This time, a child had vanished, and it hit the town harder than anything that had happened before. Panic set in, and once more the church's dark history came. What many didn't know was that behind closed doors there were efforts being made, efforts that hadn't been attempted in decades. There was a group of priests from surrounding areas who were more than just priests. They had dedicated their lives to studying the occult, exorcisms, and all things connected to the supernatural. They had been called upon only in the most dire of circumstances, and they had been waiting for a moment like this, when they might have a chance to confront the evil festering in Morton's basement. Father Michael, an older priest with a gaunt face and deep, sunken eyes, had seen more than his fair share of battles with the supernatural. He had been the first to sound the alarm when Jacob disappeared. He recognized the signs immediately. St. Morton's was not just haunted by restless spirits. Something far darker had taken root in the church's depths. Father Michael wasted no time contacting his closest allies. Father Thomas from St. Augustine's, Father Gabriel from the nearby monastery, and Father Lucas, a younger but fiercely courageous priest, known for his willingness to dive headfirst into danger when others would hesitate. Together they formed an ancient circle known as the Order of Sancta Lux, a brotherhood tasked with combating forces of darkness throughout the ages. The priests gathered in the rectory of St. Augustine's late one night, the air thick with tension. Candles flickered on the wooden table, casting long shadows on the stone walls. Maps of the old church were spread before them. "We must act swiftly," Father Michael said, his voice low but filled with urgency. "Whatever is lurking in St. Morton's has taken the boy. If we delay, it will consume him entirely." Father Thomas, his hands shaking slightly as he turned the pages of an old book, nodded in agreement. "I've read about such entities before. Ancient beings that thrive on fear and suffering. If we're dealing with what I think we are..." Father Lucas, pacing the room, clenched his fists. "We can't let this thing take another life. It's time to confront it head on. Father Gabriel, the most scholarly of the group, placed a series of relics on the table. A vial of holy water, a wooden crucifix blessed by the Pope, and a large, dusty book bound in leather. "These are the tools we'll need," he said quietly. "But this won't be like any exorcism we've performed before. This is no ordinary demon. It's a force much older, something that has been feeding on the souls of the innocent for centuries. It won't go down easily." The priests prayed together, their words solemn and reverent, asking for strength and guidance in the battle to come. The town had been plagued by this darkness for too long. The following night, under the cover of darkness, the 4 priests made their way to St. Morton's. The town was silent, the streets deserted. It was as if the very air was holding its breath, waiting for what was to come. As they approached the church, they could feel the malevolent presence seeping out of its walls like a thick, oily fog. The temperature dropped sharply, and the wind howled through the broken windows, carrying with it faint whispers. Father Michael led the way, pushing open the heavy doors with a grunt. The interior of the church was just as Jacob had described, dark, cold, and filled with an overwhelming sense of dread. The shadows seemed to move of their own accord. They made their way to the basement door, each step feeling heavier than the last. The door stood slightly ajar, as if inviting them inside. Father Lucas tightened his grip on the crucifix in his hand, his jaw set in determination. "This is where it's strongest," Father Michael said quietly. They descended the stairs slowly, their breaths visible in the freezing air. As they reached the bottom, the darkness seemed to close in around them, and the faint sound of a child's voice echoed through the corridor. "Help me." Father Gabriel shuddered. "That's Jacob." The priests moved forward, entering the large room at the end of the corridor. In the center stood the old wooden altar, just as Emily had seen. But this time the room was filled with an oppressive, tangible darkness that seemed to pulse. The shadows gathered around the altar, coalescing into a shape, a figure, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. Father Michael stepped forward, holding out his crucifix. "In the name of God, I command you to release the boy," he shouted, his voice echoing through the chamber. The figure did not move. Instead, it seemed to grow taller, its form twisting and stretching as it loomed over the priests, its eyes glowing with a malevolent fire locked onto Father Michael. The air grew thick with an unnatural energy, and the walls of the room began to vibrate. The entity's voice echoed in their minds, a deep, guttural sound that filled them with dread. "He is mine," it hissed. "You cannot save him." Father Thomas, clutching his rosary tightly, stepped forward. "We are servants of the Almighty," he said, his voice shaking but resolute. With that, Father Gabriel began chanting the ancient Latin rites of exorcism, his voice rising above the entity's whispers. The air crackled with energy as he spoke, and the shadows seemed to recoil slightly, as if in pain. Father Lucas sprinkled holy water around the room, and the droplets sizzled and steamed as they hit the ground. The entity let out a low, guttural growl, its form flickering and shifting in the dim light. But as the priests pressed forward, the entity grew more aggressive. It lashed out with tendrils of shadow, striking at the priests with a force that sent them stumbling backward. Father Michael raised his crucifix, shouting the Lord's Prayer, his voice strong and unwavering, despite the pain that shot through his body. The entity screamed, a sound so terrible and inhuman that it made the walls of the church tremble. But still the priests did not falter. They continued their prayers, their faith unwavering, even as the dark. Then, as Father Gabriel reached the final words of the exorcism, something miraculous happened. The shadows began to dissipate, pulling back as if burned by the words of the prayer. The figure writhed and twisted, its form breaking apart like smoke caught in a strong wind. "No," it screamed, its voice filled with rage and despair. But the power of their faith was too strong. Jacob lay on the floor near the altar, his body cold and still. The priests rushed to his side, their hands trembling as they checked for signs of life. But then, slowly, Jacob's eyes fluttered open, and he let out a weak, shuddering breath. "He's alive," Father Michael whispered, tears of relief filling his eyes. The priests gathered around the boy, offering silent prayers of thanks. They had risked their lives to save him, and by the grace of God they had succeeded. But as they carried Jacob out of the church, they knew that the battle had taken its toll. St. Morton's would forever remain a dark place, haunted by the memories of the evil that had once lurked there. The priests had driven the entity away, but the scars of its presence would linger in the walls of the church and in the minds of those who had faced it. Jacob, though saved, would never be the same. For now, the town could rest easy, knowing that the priests of the Order of Sancta Lux had once again stood against the darkness and prevailed. But deep down, they all knew that evil was never truly gone. It only waited, biding its time in the shadows, until it found another way back into the world, and when it did, the Order would be ready. Thank you for watching our video. For more creepy stories, Stay tuned to our channel. Like, subscribe and share. See you next time. Till then, take care.